This is Neil Schneider for MTBS-TV at the big summit in Miami, Florida. To my immediate right, it's an honor. Joining us is Robert Godwin. He's CEO of CG Publishing, Inc. Tremendous history when it comes to space coverage and all the exciting history. And I just want to add another accreditation to his name. He's also space curator for the Canadian Air and Space Museum. It's not quite active, but again, a very rich history. Right, yeah. So, Robert, tell us a little bit about yourself for those who aren't familiar.
Well, I started out as a publisher and had a lot of intellectual property, a lot of books and so forth about space exploration. But evolved into multimedia, and I started to do a lot of CD-ROMs and DVDs and DVD-ROMs back in the day when that was important. And now I'm starting to move into other things because I had a lot of 3D stuff that I created over the years.
We'll go into that 3D stuff very shortly. Tell us, how did you develop an interest in the space program? I mean, you've got a very specialized career.
Well, that's true, yeah. I've been interested in space exploration since I was a kid. I remember all the early Apollo launches and Gemini missions, the late Gemini missions from the 60s. So I got very fortunate. I happened to find myself in the presence of Buzz Aldrin one evening for dinner. And Buzz asked me to do him a favor, which just about knocked me off my chair. And of course I said yes. I didn't even know what he wanted me to do, but he asked me if I would put together a book about the first mission that flew around the moon. And of course I agreed, and that led to a career in space publishing.
Wait, you're not illustrating just how big a favor this was. How much time did you have to create this book?
Well, Buzz asked me if I'd do it for him on Thursday, and I had until Friday afternoon to get the book finished, laid out, and to the printer. So I worked pretty much around the clock for 4 or 5 days to put a book together. It was quite a challenge.
And how did Buzz return the favor?
Well, the deal was if I got the book done in time, he would introduce me to the crew of Apollo 8, and I delivered on time, and so he introduced me to Frank Borman and Jim Lovell and Bill Anders. And at the end of the evening, he turned around to me and said, Apollo 9's anniversary is coming up in 3 months, and that was the beginning of a very long, successful space imprint.
Now, it's no small feat to work with the likes of Buzz Aldrin. Was there a media circus attached to, astronauts like him?
Hanging around with Buzz is always a media circus. I've been fortunate to chaperone him on more than one occasion where I had to pick him up at the airport and take him to an event. I've done that twice now for him, and it's a little surreal because when people realize you're Buzz's handler for the day, some very important, famous people end up coming up to you going, can I meet Dr. Aldrin? And then you sort of become the gatekeeper for a few hours. That's pretty surreal.
So you must, and I'm joking when I say in your travels, because you haven't exactly gone up to space, but you've spoken with the giants. You've had access to all kinds of footage and materials. Can you talk a little bit about some of the amazing stuff you've seen?
Yeah, well, very early on when I started to do CD-ROMs to go in the back of these books that Buzz had asked me to do, NASA had not actually invested any money in digitizing their still photography in high resolution. Almost all of it was very low-res scans that were being handed out internally on CD-ROMs. And so I started to actually spend the money to have the negatives pulled out of the vaults. They were being kept in refrigerated conditions, and have them thawed out and then scanned at high resolution. And one of the first things I realized when I actually was working from microfiche, if you can believe that, and I realized that there was these sequences of panoramic images that the astronauts shot on the surface of the moon, where they would literally stand with a Hasselblad and turn like this as they were taking the pictures. Photoshop had just sort of evolved to the point where it became possible to stitch these things together. And so I was really the first one to create full panoramic images from high-resolution scans of the lunar photography. And that then led to, I can do QuickTime VR, which nobody had ever done before. So I created these almost like virtual tours where you could zoom in on the landing site, click on a hotspot, and it would take you right to that location, and you could do a 360 QuickTime viewing of the site. Now today, of course, we can do lots more with that, but back then that was pretty primitive and pretty early.
So when they were originally shooting this footage, did they have any idea that it could be repurposed for an immersive experience?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this was purely for geology reasons. It was to see the landing site so that the geologists back on Earth could get a context on what rocks were being picked up and where they came from. They did a primitive stitch together in National Geographic, but it always had overlaps because they didn't have digital stitching in those days, right? So it was literally all optical stitching.
So for our technophiles, how did you go about doing this? Like, was it really difficult to take this source content and extrapolate? What did you do?
Back then it was pretty tough because there weren't any instruction manuals out there, and layering was very primitive in those days as well. Photoshop didn't come up with layers till sometime later, so you were literally working with cut and paste and trying to sort of bleed things out. Then layering came along, that made it a lot simpler. One of the hardest things is color matching, because every time they turned the camera, the color tones would change because there was no sort of care taken in the processing of the images. And on the moon, the actual ambient light changes depending on if you're looking up sun or down sun. So when you're looking up sun, the lunar soil is almost a white gray, and when you're looking down sun, it's brown. And so when you're trying to stitch gray to brown, it was pretty tough. And I think the highest praise I got for the work I did very early on was Jack Schmitt, who was a US senator and the only geologist to walk on the moon. The first time I showed him my panoramas, he said that's the first time I've seen it look the way it actually did. So I was pretty pleased with that.
That's wonderful. Now, has there been any stereoscopic footage shot in the space program? Did they do any early work in that regard?
What's interesting is they actually did take 3D cameras with Apollo to the moon, to the lunar surface, but they were specifically designed for shooting rocks on the ground. So the camera had a focal length that was maybe 2.5, 3 feet. I don't know if you can see my sort of hands like that, but it had a handle because the suits were so stiff they couldn't bend over. So they would actually grab this handle of the camera, put the camera down on the surface, and the lens was in the handle with a fixed focal length of about 3 feet, and the astronaut would just grip the handle and it would take a stereo shot of the surface of the soil. And so they could get a sense of the size of the rock and how big it was, and the context of where they found it. So there are a bunch of those. They're not very exciting because it's literally pictures of rocks. But that's really the only 3D cameras that they took up to the moon during the Apollo program.
Amazing. So you have, the thing about space is you've got the real aspect or the real life aspects, but then there's the imaginative and the ethical aspects of space. I understand you have a particular interest in Stanley Kubrick's work, 2001.
Yeah,
maybe you could fill us in a little bit.
Well, my very good friend Fred Ordway was the technical advisor to Stanley Kubrick on 2001: A Space Odyssey. And Fred spent the last 50 years running around the world telling his story about how they created this amazing blanket of technology that Kubrick was able to put on the screen in 1968. April 68 is when it came out. Fred was really the guy who brought that technology to Boreham Wood Studios in London, so that Kubrick's vision could be realized with such amazing detail. And Fred and I worked last year together on a book, but just prior to that we did a book called 2001: The Lost Science, and Fred literally went dumpster diving back in the 60s to save the blueprints that Kubrick had just thrown out. And these blueprints were the designs for all of the spacecraft used in the movie. And they were drawn up by real draftsmen. They weren't just drawn up by, some special effects guy who wasn't quite sure. So everything in these blueprints was down to the centimeter accuracy. And Fred saved them all. So I was very fortunate to work with a guy called Adam Johnson, who was a Lockheed Martin engineer and a 2001 aficionado and expert. And Adam restored all these blueprints, which gave me the ability to then take them and extrapolate them into 3D wireframes. And we were able to then start to build the inside of things like the Discovery spacecraft in full detail, and then create 3D fly-throughs of it and take the camera places where Stanley Kubrick could never have done.
We should talk a little bit about the Discovery spacecraft. I mean, for those that don't remember, they should actually look up the film, a true classic, of course. And there's this famous scene where David Bowman's jogging you know, in this circle, in this centrifuge, and you know, you're watching the film and you don't really know how they're doing it, especially in 1967, 68. Can you elaborate how they did that and why this, what you're describing, is so, you know, influential? It's such a breakthrough for them.
Well, I believe the film was so influential still to this day, not only because of the superb cinematography, it actually set new standards in filmmaking, but also because the actual imaginary technology that Fred Ordway and Arthur C. Clarke brought to the screen was as accurate as it could possibly be. The Discovery spacecraft, which you just mentioned, was a design that Arthur Clarke that is, came up with in the late 40s, where he understood that you needed nuclear propulsion to be able to get to the planets. It's really too hard with chemical propulsion to take something with people on board to the planets. And to do that, you have to put the reactor somewhere where it's nowhere near the crew so that they don't get irradiated during the voyage. So Arthur suggested that the spacecraft would be this dumbbell shape with the reactor at one end and the command module with the crew at the other end. And that evolved into the Discovery spacecraft used in 2001 with this giant nuclear engine on the back. So, you know, that's sort of a brief capsule, pardon the pun, capsule synopsis of the...
From what I read, like with the Discovery, like I'm going to use a centrifuge example. I understand they built this giant Ferris wheel for the set. Is there truth to that?
Yes. Yeah.
And can you elaborate on some of the camera shots that you think would have been impossible before that you could now achieve based on your work?
Well, Kubrick wanted to create this vision of artificial gravity, which can be accomplished in space by rotation, as long as the object's big enough. Now, the centrifuge they used in the movie was not actually big enough to create one gravity. You'd have to have something much bigger, or you'd have to have it spinning much faster. But it was a good simulation. They built this centrifuge. A company called Vickers Armstrong in England, which is an aerospace company, were tasked with building it. It weighed 36 tons, I believe. It cost £250,000 sterling in 1965 to build it. They had to do structural tests on the floor of the studio to see if it could withstand the weight. Once it was built, it could rotate at an incredibly fine rate. It was meticulously controlled down to almost like a centimeter a second in rotation rate, stabilized to the point where nothing wobbled. And the clever part really was that they had put this slice through the center of the floor where Kubrick could mount a giant camera on a blade. It was on a steel blade sticking through the floor. So as the entire rotation of the centrifuge happened, the camera stayed still, and it looked as though the entire thing was moving. The astronaut, Gary Lockwood, actually stood still at the bottom, running like a hamster in a treadmill, while the set rotated around him. It was incredibly dangerous. Keir Delay had to strap himself into a seat and be rotated up 40 feet above the floor, hanging upside down with a safety belt, pretending to eat his breakfast while Kubrick said action and then rotated the entire thing around.
And yet they make that scene look so natural, as if they're just eating breakfast a day, you know, just another day at work.
Yeah, it's so superbly executed. I mean, the movie really is a masterpiece.
Now, you know, very proud that you're a fellow Canadian as well. I mean, you're in Toronto, yes?
I am, yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about, I want to make sure I get the name right, the Canadian Air and Space Museum. I understand it's somewhat retired at this point. For now, yep. What can you tell us about the museum? Well,
it was established at Downsview Airport, which was a military base in northwest Toronto. And it was put into what was the 1929 de Havilland Aircraft Factory. It's the oldest aircraft building in Canada. It's where Tiger Moths were built in just after World War I, and the Mosquito was built there during World War II. The museum had been there for about 15 years, all done on volunteer time and money. We built a full-size replica of the legendary Avro Arrow fighter there out of all aviation materials. It's a thing of beauty to see.
Maybe for those who aren't familiar, can you elaborate on the Avro Arrow, what it is? Because it is a very important part of history.
The Avro Arrow was a fighter interceptor that was commissioned by the Canadian Air Force in the 1950s and first rolled out of the factory on the day that Sputnik flew, which is October 4th, 1957. It was capable of flying at Mach 2 in a climb in 1959, which made it the fastest fighter interceptor in the world at that time. It was believed to have been capable of having a ceiling of about 80,000 feet, which was unheard of back then. It had this incredible range that would have been able to patrol the northern Canadian Arctic, and its adversary would have been Soviet backfire bombers. The entire program was cancelled in February 1959 for political reasons, and 13,000 Canadian aerospace engineers were laid off in one afternoon. It's called Black Friday, inevitably. And the cream of those engineers were plucked out of there the next morning and given U.S. visas to go and work in Langley, Virginia on a thing called the Man in Space program. And they ended up being heads of departments on Project Mercury, Project Gemini, and then the Apollo moon landings. So that's the Arrow. So
the Arrow, I take it it's either in pieces now? Like where does it stand now?
There were five built, I believe, maybe six, 5 or 6 built, and they were all cut up almost immediately after the program was cancelled. And all of the plans were ordered destroyed, and all the machine tooling and everything was cast to the wind. So
for the conspiracy theorists, are the blueprints out there?
I believe there is still a set of complete blueprints in the National Archives in Ottawa, but I haven't seen them, but I'm told that they're there.
Wonderful, wonderful. So as far as the museum's concerned, you've had some Hollywood help as well. I mean, trying to get that going. What can you tell us about the Star Wars influence, if you will?
Well, Harrison Ford is a huge aviation buff, and his favorite aircraft is the de Havilland Beaver, which was built in our building. And so when he found out that the museum was in trouble, he stepped up and helped us do a fundraising campaign and raised enough money to help us pay some rent. And we were very grateful for that. He's a big fan of Canadian aircraft.
So I take it Canada, of course, has this proud, space industry history. I just think it's an absolute crime that this is all in boxes right now. What are the plans? I mean, what's to be?
Well, our Avro Arrow replica is currently in storage at Toronto International Airport, and our collection is currently being appraised and catalogued in another building near Toronto International Airport. And we are in the process of putting together these plans for a new facility at Toronto International Airport, and I'm hoping we'll see something in the next year or two where people will be able to come and visit us again.
Keep it in Toronto. That's where it belongs.
Well, it's a Toronto story, right?
Absolutely. So, well, wonderful. And just some highlights for our viewers. This content that you have, maybe you could share a few minutes of it. Do you think it would be compatible with devices like the Oculus Rift and Immersive Reality Go and different VR devices?
Well, I don't know what possessed me to do this, but about almost 20 years ago, I bought a 3D video camera. And at the time, this was a thing that was about so big, and it's strapped onto the front of a conventional 8mm or VHS video camera, and it used a prism to split the image and send the signals to the interlaced lines on the camera. So the odd lines got one image and the even lines got the other. If you played it back afterwards, it was unwatchable. It was this sort of fuzzy blur. But it came with a little infrared transmitter and LCD shutter glasses, and the 3D was superlative. It was really excellent for its time. So I ran around everywhere with this camera, just filming important things, and particularly space-related stuff. So I was very fortunate to find myself in the launch room at Kennedy Space Center one day when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked in, and I was 3 feet away from them with a 3D video camera. And I swear I probably am still to this day the only person who ever got 3D footage of Neil and Buzz together. It's sort of being like with Lennon and McCartney or something with a 3D camera. I then took the thing off and I was at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena when Opportunity landed on Mars, and that entire explosion of enthusiasm erupted in the room. I had all that on 3D. I was out there for the X Prize when Burt Rutan's Spaceship One team won the X Prize, and Richard Branson was there, and I filmed the entire press conference with Branson and Anusha Ansari and Paul Allen and everything, all with the 3D camera. So I have some pretty historic 3D stuff.
I hope you get to share some of it with us. I know our viewers would love to see it.
Part of the reason I'm here at the big conference is you know, there are people who are interested in this footage that I have because they know it's probably the only stuff of its kind, you know, from that time.
Well, we're here at the big summit. I mean, you've been talking about older footage, like footage that was created, you know, decades ago and maybe being repurposed for VR and 3D and so on. What are your thoughts on immersive tech and virtual reality? Where do you see things going?
You know, it's kind of interesting. About 30 years ago, I remember going to an arcade in the local shopping mall, and they had this VR thing where you put on a headset that looked much like Oculus Rift, except it was being driven by a computer the size of a pickup truck. And, you know, it was kind of disorienting, but it was quite effective. I mean, the difference between that and what I'm seeing with Oculus is really not it's not too different. Really what's happened is obviously this latency issue that everybody keeps talking about, where the camera, the movement of the image is keeping up with your head movement, is obviously vastly improved, and the resolution is considerably improved. And remember, when I'm talking about, there was no digital video, it was all analog video. It was very peculiar back then. So this is obviously taken a long time in my mind. I mean, this is a long time coming. But I'm hopeful. I've seen some impressive things with the Zeiss thing, which is incredibly cheap, using the cell phone, the Samsung. I thought that was really amazingly cheap. And Mary Spio's Next Galaxy audio system is really very impressive. It's almost like surround sound strapped to your head, complete with subwoofer. It makes you shake. It's pretty impressive.
360-degree audio, so that's really something else. See,
I grew up with quadraphonic, right?
So you sound hopeful.
I'm showing my age now. Pink Floyd. Yeah, I am hopeful. I think it's starting to get there now, and there's certainly a lot of enthusiasm here and a lot of very bright people working towards this.
So for the space program, for the likes of NASA and the private companies and so on, do you think VR is going to be very important for education and getting their messages out there?
That's what I'm hoping that I can contribute to, is the educational side of it. But of course, NASA have been using a form of VR on Mars, for God's sakes. You know, I mean, they've been using it on the space station for years now, but they had tons of money to throw at it. You know, we couldn't have done Sojourner back in 1997 as effectively as they did if they hadn't had a three-dimensional imaging system on board that little tiny rover. You know, what is that, nearly 20 years ago now? You know, so NASA's well ahead of this game.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Neil.
This is Neil Schneider for MTBS-TV at the Big Summit. We'll be back with more. Thank you for watching.